Welcome to the debate. When we talk about upgrading a tool in the workplace, there's usually this built-in expectation of a seamless one-to-one replacement.
Right, like you swap a manual hammer for a nail gun.
Exactly. You swap out the tool, and the assumption is that the carpenter just builds the exact same house, just, a little bit faster. It's supposed to be a clean swap.
Yeah, because the fundamental nature of the work doesn't change. You just squeeze a trigger instead of swinging your arm. The human is still completely in control of the pace and the direction of the tool.
Right. But think about what happens when you hand someone a tool that doesn't just drive the nail. Imagine handing them a tool that reads the architectural blueprint, walks off to fetch the lumber, and then starts framing the wall all by itself while the carpenter is sitting in the truck, having a coffee.
I think a lot of people would love that tool, honestly.
Oh, sure. But suddenly, you don't just have a faster hammer, you have a completely broken construction site.
Because nobody is managing the new process.
Exactly. Because nobody established who is supposed to be inspecting that automated work, or who is ordering the next batch of supplies to keep up, or, what happens when the tool encounters a bad architectural drawing and just keeps building anyway.
It is the absolute definition of a workflow earthquake. You are entirely redesigning the relationship between the worker and the work.
And that earthquake is exactly the fundamental transformation we are examining today. We are looking at the massive shift occurring right now in workplace artificial intelligence. For years, we've lived comfortably in the era of conversational AI.
Which are essentially systems that advise us, right? They summarize documents, they generate text.
Yeah, exactly, while the human firmly remains in the driver's seat. But now we are crossing the threshold into agentic AI. These are semi-autonomous systems that actually execute multi-step workflows on a user's behalf. We are moving from a paradigm of consultation to a paradigm of complete delegation.
Which, if you're listening to this and you manage a team, probably sounds like a dream, until you actually try to implement it at an enterprise scale and realize the friction involved.
Spot on. And that brings us to the central question we are exploring today. Does the transition to agentic AI necessitate a slow, disruptive, and fundamental redesign of organizational structures and workflows?
Or does its uniquely rapid diffusion pattern suggest a much smoother, self-accelerating integration once initial barriers are cleared by technical pioneers?
Exactly. And our entire discussion today is grounded in Jonathan H. Westover's research article, The Diffusion of Agentic AI, From Engineers to the Enterprise. I will be arguing that realizing the true value of agentic AI requires arduous structural workflow redesigns and a fundamental shift in workforce skills, making organizational capability a severe bottleneck.
And I'll be arguing that the empirical evidence actually shows an unprecedentedly rapid and frictionless diffusion of agentic AI across non-technical departments, proving that, once early adopters lay the groundwork, organizational barriers dissolve almost organically.
All right, so let's lay our cards on the table. My perspective is rooted in a core economic reality, which is that moving from an advisory tool to a delegatory agent is not an incremental tech upgrade.
Right, it's not just a faster hammer.
It is not. It requires what economists call complementary innovations. To help the listener visualize this, Westover draws on a famous historical study by Paul David regarding the transition from steam to electric power. In the late 19th century, factories were built vertically, multiple stories high, specifically to accommodate the massive central steam engine's complex system of pulleys and belts that ran up through the floors.
Right, so the physical architecture of the building was entirely dictated by the limitation of the power source.
Exactly. So when factories first got electric motors, they just dropped them into these vertical factories, replacing the steam engine. And productivity didn't budge, it flatlined.
Because the building itself was still the problem.
Right. Because the workflow was still constrained by the vertical design. The massive productivity gains from electricity only occurred decades later when manufacturers completely redesigned their physical factories into flat, sprawling assembly lines to take advantage of distributed electric power at individual workstations. Agentic AI is doing the exact same thing to our digital workflows.
I see the parallel you are drawing. It's a structural barrier.
If you just drop an autonomous agent into a traditional sequential human workflow without deliberately redesigning your organization around delegation, verification, and new oversight mechanisms, you don't get a productivity boom. You get downstream bottlenecks where humans simply cannot review the AI's output fast enough.
Right.
The research Westover highlights explicitly points this out. If the human review process doesn't fundamentally change, the AI's incredible speed is completely irrelevant to the bottom line of the business.
Well, I come at it from a different way. That historical analogy of electrification is beautifully poetic, and I love the imagery of the vertical factories. But it entirely fails to capture the sheer velocity of agentic AI.
How so?
The core economic principle is the same.
Because we are not talking about tearing down brick-and-mortar factories and pouring new concrete. We are talking about digital workflows, and the data simply does not support a decades-long or even years-long adoption struggle.
But digital architecture can be just as rigid as physical architecture, sometimes more so given legacy IT systems. It can be, but look at the actual adoption data from the source material. Researchers analyzed large-scale usage data from a major agentic platform, and yes, the initial technical workers, the software developers, the engineers, they took months to figure out how to integrate these tools.
They hit those exact friction points I'm talking about.
They did. But here is the critical part that breaks your electrification analogy. When later adopting non-technical functions like legal and recruiting got their hands on it, they transitioned in a matter of weeks, not decades.
Okay, but
At the technology frontier right now, Johnston et al. Notes that agentic AI has already displaced conversational interfaces, accounting for over 99% of AI-generated output.
Look, I don't dispute the adoption rate, but adoption is not the same as productive integration.
But the speed matters. The organizational friction you were pointing to is real, but it is temporary. It is entirely front-loaded by those technical champions who figure out the digital architecture first. It is not a permanent structural barrier that requires a painful top-down, multi-year redesign of the modern enterprise.
That is an interesting point. Though I'd frame it differently, because we have to look at what happens when that speed hits reality on the ground. Let's move beyond just looking at adoption curves and look at actual measurable performance.
Okay, let's look at performance.
You mentioned the speed of uptake, but speeding up an individual task does not automatically boost organizational performance. Think back to our factory assembly line. If I give one worker on that line a machine that lets them work 10 times faster,
Right.
but the human quality inspector at the end of the line is still working at their original speed, I haven't increased the factory's output one bit.
Right. You've just created a massive pileup of unchecked inventory on the factory floor.
Precisely. And this is exactly what recent studies, like Dillon et al. In 2025, have found on generative AI implementation. They observed that massive individual time savings didn't actually change the quantity or composition of final delivered work in a meaningful way.
Because of the review process.
Yes. If I delegate a complex data analysis to an agentic AI, it might complete it in 3 minutes instead of 3 days. But I still have to sit down, read it, verify its methodology, check its sources, and integrate it into my larger project. That verification step is the new bottleneck.
Right.
Unless management intervenes to fundamentally restructure how work is routed, changing the whole assembly line, that individual speed is just an illusion at the organizational level.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You are assuming the verification bottleneck is an insurmountable wall unless there's some grand top-down management-led redesign.
It historically has been.
But you are assuming the human inspector just sits there overwhelmed. The frontier data shows us that workers are solving this natively, on their own. You say the final output isn't changing. The data in Westover's paper explicitly looked at this. The median workers in these frontier organizations increased their AI-generated output by 10 to 50 times within just 7 months.
10 to 50 times?
Yes! Legal professionals increased their final output 13-fold. Research roles saw a 50-fold growth.
But wait, how is that even physically possible? If a lawyer still has to read every single word of a brief to ensure the AI didn't invent a fake case, how do they produce 13 times more briefs? I mean, the math doesn't work if they are doing traditional verification.
Because they aren't doing traditional verification.
What the data shows is that organizations are successfully and organically moving to parallel execution models. Let me explain how that actually works.
Please do.
Instead of one person doing one task sequentially, like drafting a document, then checking it, then moving to the next, an individual is launching 4, 5, or 10 asynchronous agentic workflows simultaneously.
So they are running multiple automated processes at the same time.
Exactly. While the lawyer is reviewing the final draft of Brief A, Agent B is formatting the citations for another case. Agent C is pulling the opposing counsel's win-loss record, and Agent D is cross-referencing state laws.
That sounds chaotic.
But they aren't waiting for a top-down redesign to tell them how to do this. The workers themselves are adopting managerial behaviors. They are learning to review flagged anomalies and integrate outputs while the agents handle the deep execution. The system isn't grinding to a halt at a bottleneck. It is experiencing a productivity explosion because the nature of review itself is becoming parallel.
Okay, a 50-fold increase in generated output from a research role using parallel execution. That is exactly what terrifies me, especially if the human evaluating all of this output hasn't developed the capacity to truly know what they are looking at. And this brings us to the most disruptive structural change of all, the day-to-day reality of the human worker and the survival of deep domain expertise.
You think we are losing our expertise because the machine is doing the heavy lifting?
I think the fundamental mechanism of how humans learn their jobs is being broken. We are shifting from direct execution, actually writing the code, manually drafting the legal brief, digging row by row through the financial models, to higher order activities like delegation and verification.
Sure, which is a good thing.
But it demands a totally new distributed AI literacy across every level of the company. If I am a senior partner at a law firm, I can rapidly review an AI's brief because I spent 10 years writing them manually. I have the reps. I know what a good brief feels like. But what happens to the junior associate?
They use the AI to draft it.
Right. And if we just hand them agentic tools on day one, they don't learn the law. They become what the research calls prompt operators. They learn how to ask the machine for a brief, but they never build the core analytical intuition required to catch a subtle legal hallucination.
Well, and this isn't just theoretical. The source material points to firms like Deloitte that are having to implement highly intentional, top-down apprenticeship models. They are literally forcing junior staff to manually execute core analytical tasks precisely to preserve that domain expertise.
Right. If an organization doesn't actively structurally intervene to protect its knowledge base, it will hollow itself out. It will lose its underlying expertise over time because the humans are no longer doing the grueling foundational work that builds the expertise in the first place.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered that this transition might actually elevate the expert rather than hollow them out? You're framing delegation as a loss of traditional skills, but the research points to an entirely different dynamic.
I'm listening.
The economic labor data shows that domain expertise is actually becoming more valuable, not less, in an agentic environment. Look at Hitzig et al. Or Tambay in 2026.
How so? If the AI is doing the work, isn't the human just an editor?
No, because the AI is handling the routine execution, so the premium shifts entirely to judgment. Think about it. Only a true expert can properly set the initial, highly complex parameters for a multi-step workflow. Only a true expert recognizes when the intermediate steps the AI took are logically flawed.
But again, where do those experts come from?
You say junior workers will just become prompt operators, but the labor market analysis in the text, like Chen et al., shows that occupations structured around human-AI collaboration are seeing increasing demand and rising skill complexity. The market is not de-skilling, it is upskilling.
I hear the word upskilling, but what does that actually mean for the junior associate? How do they get the judgment if they aren't doing the grunt work?
Because we are moving away from treating human beings as biological execution engines and moving toward treating them as orchestrators of intelligence, the junior associate doesn't need to spend 10 years doing mindless document review to understand the nuances of the law.
They kind of do, though.
They don't. They can spend that time analyzing overarching strategy, testing complex edge cases against the AI, and learning how to evaluate logic architectures. The cognitive load isn't disappearing, it's shifting to a more strategic level. It's an empowering shift. They learn to evaluate systems rather than just typing out paragraphs.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Because being an orchestrator of intelligence sounds magnificent until that intelligence executes a catastrophic error at 3 a.m. while the orchestrator is sound asleep.
Well, yes.
And this is where the structural friction is most unavoidable. Let's talk about governance, risk, and organizational learning.
The risk profile is definitely different, I'll concede that.
It's not just different. It's on another planet. Conversational AI is inherently synchronous and advisory. It gives you text on a screen, you read it, you decide to use it, or you don't. The risk is bounded by your immediate oversight.
Right.
Agentic AI, by definition, is asynchronous and autonomous. It can modify files, send emails to clients, execute financial trades, and commit code without human supervision. The risks of cascading errors, where mistake in step 1 automatically infects step 2, 3, and 4 before a human even logs on, are massive.
Which is why you don't just give an agent unfettered access to your core databases on day 1.
Exactly. Because of this, organizations cannot just let workers organically adopt these tools. They require complex tiered governance structures. Look at the example in the text regarding JP Morgan Chase. They couldn't just let their teams run wild.
Sure.
They had to implement a strict, risk-based approval framework. Client-facing applications and autonomous financial modeling have to go through rigorous, time-consuming review processes, while internal research gets lighter oversight. You cannot just flip a switch and let agents run loose.
Nobody is saying flip a switch.
But developing those audit trails, building automated verification tests, establishing rollback capabilities, that mandates strict top-down control. And top-down control inherently, deliberately slows down ad hoc adoption. You cannot have hyper-fast organic diffusion when the enterprise risk team rightly requires a 6-month security audit before an agent is allowed to touch a database.
I absolutely acknowledge the need for governance. The risks of autonomous execution, especially cascading errors, are very real. But you are pointing to the creation of governance as a permanent anchor dragging down adoption when the text proves that adaptive governance actually functions as a catapult once it is built.
A catapult? I mean, a 6-month security review is a catapult now?
Yes, building the very first safety frameworks takes time. But let's look at how this actually diffuses through cross-functional knowledge transfer. Westover highlights Unilever's AI Center of Excellence as the perfect model for this.
Right, the co.
What happens is the early technical adopters, the software engineers, the data scientists, they absorb that initial friction. They work with risk management, they figure out the API limits, the security protocols, the rollback features, and then they create governance templates and reusable pre-approved workflows. They build a sandbox.
Okay, I see how a center of excellence creates a sandbox. I actually really like that Unilever example. But my confusion is, doesn't that just shift the bottleneck to the engineers building the sandbox?
How so?
If HR or legal has to wait for the engineers to custom build them a secure environment, they are inherently constrained by the capacity of those engineers. We are right back to a structural bottleneck.
Only for the very first iteration. The beauty of these reusable workflow templates is that they become modular. When the HR department wants to adopt agentic AI for recruiting, they don't have to start from scratch, and they don't need an engineer to build a brand new sandbox.
They just use the old one.
They are handed a secure, pre-packaged infrastructure. They just adapt the pre-approved modules to fit their specific task. This is the exact mechanism that explains the lightning-fast adoption curves we talked about earlier. The knowledge transfer from the tech department to the non-tech departments eliminates all the redundant experimentation. So yes, governance is necessary, but it is a highly scalable asset. Once the technical vanguard clears the brush and lays the tracks, the rest of the enterprise boards a high-speed train. They don't have to rebuild the tracks.
It compounds, I will give you that, but it still requires a fundamental, intentional shift in how the organization perceives and routes work. Let's bring this to a close and summarize where we stand on this transition.
Sure.
From my perspective, the true challenge of agentic AI isn't the software itself. It's the human organization. Without deliberate structural workflow redesign, we are just adding incredible speed to a broken assembly line. Organizations that successfully integrate these tools don't just plug AI into their old methods. They restructure their entire case routing and escalation procedures.
Right.
Furthermore, without intentional apprenticeship models to protect learning and strict tiered governance frameworks to prevent cascading errors, organizations will fail to translate task-level speed into actual business performance. And worse, they risk hollowing out their core domain expertise.
And my summary is that the empirical data reveals a uniquely compressed adoption cycle that defies those historical analogies. Unlike electrification or early computing, which literally took decades to assimilate into business practices, agentic AI is diffusing across diverse, non-technical departments in a matter of weeks.
If the sandboxes are built.
Yes, the organizational friction you're highlighting definitely exists, but it is absorbed and resolved by a technical vanguard very early in the cycle. Once those early adopters establish the infrastructure and those adaptive governance sandboxes, that knowledge transfers seamlessly. This allows the rest of the enterprise to scale their output exponentially, using parallel execution without requiring a paralyzing top-down structural redesign.
Well, despite our different views on the friction of this transition, we definitely converge on a few critical realities today. We both agree that agentic AI fundamentally changes the locus of human work. It is undeniably moving us away from direct, step-by-step task execution and pushing us toward higher-order strategy, delegation, and complex verification.
Absolutely. That shift is undeniable. And we also both strongly agree that deep domain expertise remains the critical anchor in this new automated world. The human expert isn't becoming obsolete. Their judgment is simply being leveraged at a much higher, more systemic level.
It is a fascinating transition, and there's incredible value in looking at it through both the lens of structural caution and the lens of empirical speed. There is much more to explore in Westover's research, particularly regarding the specific granular frameworks for adaptive governance that we only briefly touched on today.
Definitely worth a deep dive for anyone listening.
But for now, we will leave it to you, the listener, to decide which force, the inevitable friction of organizational redesign or the unprecedented acceleration of digital diffusion, will ultimately define the era of agentic AI in your workplace. Think back to our construction site. When the nail gun learns to read the blueprint, do you have to tear down the whole site to accommodate it? Or do the carpenters simply learn to become architects overnight? Thank you for joining us.